Okay everyone, I'll get started. So I want to declare open this extraordinary council Fluoride Tribunal meeting today, Tuesday the 28th of May, running through till Wednesday the 5th of June. So we've got an agenda in front of us. So I'll take apologies first. I've got no apologies. I'll confirm the agenda and I'll move it as it is there, and seconded by Councillor Bell. All those in favour? Carried, thank you. Declarations of interest, and we have some noted there, and so those will be recorded in the minutes. Okay, any other declarations of interest, councillors? Okay, thank you. All right, we're now going to move into the hearings itself. Now, just a couple of sort of procedural matters I just want to go through for submitters and those in the public. And welcome along, everyone. And thank you very much for coming out on what I'm told is Hamilton's coldest day so far this year. But we've got excellent facilities here, and I want to thank Wintec very much for making those available for us. The first thing I just want to remind everyone about is we're going to keep strictly to the time. So as submitters come in, our staff have been assisting them with the process and what's going to happen this morning, and we will be keeping strictly to the time. So please bear that in mind when you're making your presentations and answering the questions. And we have Jacob here, the committee secretary. He will be the timekeeper, and his word is final, I guess they say, when it comes to the time. The second thing is it's really important for councillors that we hear what everyone's got to say without interruption from members of the public. So we want to make sure that process is smooth. So those in the public that might have a view about what's being said, I'd ask you just not to voice that during the process of submissions, so that the councillors can hear everything that people want us to hear. The third thing is we've got great facilities here, the practicalities of everything, tea and coffee and all, toilets, etc. is all out there. Just ask the council staff if you're not sure and they'll be able to help you. There is filming going on, as you can see, that's evident. So this is being live streamed webcam on our own council website. And then we have some other people filming here, and there will be photographs being taken. There are a number of media here as well, so I just wanted to alert you to that fact. Skype, there are some people who are Skyping in. That will be shown on the big screen behind us so that everyone can see that, and our staff will alert us to when those presentations are as they come through. And I think there is also some films that are going to be shown during some of the presentations, and again they'll be on the big screen so everyone can hear those. I don't think there's any other process matters. The other thing I just wanted to remind everyone is councillors have their submissions on their computers and iPads. So when you see them looking at those devices, it's because that's where the information is. Rather than printing out hundreds of pieces of paper, we put them electronically on our systems. So I just want to let the public know that we are actually looking at the material in front of us and using our devices to do that. All right, is there any, councillors, anything else, any other questions or anything else you wanted to add to that? Yes.
Councillor Gow's apology.
Yes, he'll be noted. Thank you very much. Right, okay, now this is where the presentations will happen. Now this morning we've got two groups, and I'm just looking at the the first one will be the Fluoride Action Network and Fluoride Free Hamilton group. And then after that we'll have morning tea, and then we will have the Waikato DHB presentation. Now for those who are presenting in groups, this is where the speakers will speak from, but members of those groups, there are seats available up here so that those who are speaking as part of that presentation, you can all come up together and sit at the seats up there rather than remaining in where the members of the public are sitting. All right, so I think we're ready to go. So the first speakers, as I said, this is a 90-minute presentation and then 30 minutes allowed for questions. And as I said, we will be keeping strictly to the time frame. And these are for the Fluoride Action Network and Fluoride Free Hamilton. So if those people would like to come forward, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Councillors, I'm just looking at submission number 855 on your documents.
Hello.
Good point, Councillor.
That's ready to go, is it?
Yeah, so just
Cool.
volumes, Tegan. We've got 3 volumes of paperwork, so what's the cut-off just in terms of numbers for the volumes? Sorry, just to be helpful for everyone. Okay, volumes of 500, so we're on volume 2, 855 is in volume 2.
Councillors, we've also put a hard copy of the primary presentations on your desk for ease this morning.
Oh, right, thank you very much. Yes, this is another issue, I suppose, for submitters. If you do have additional material, just give it to the council staff and they'll make sure that all of us have it. Yes, Councillor McPherson.
Sorry, we will also need a page number because the way that they're set up in here, we can only find it by page number.
Yes, that's right.
And there's
855,
no-
what page is that?
I'll go and find out. If you have access to the FTP site,
Yeah.
all their
Yeah.
individuals, you can click on and find individuals.
No, well, they're there by volume, actually. That's where I got
So,
it.
councillors, just on that, just if you're in Good Reader, I'm sure all of you know how to work Good Reader, but just a little reminder that Blair's reminded me of, so it's helpful for me as well, is down the bottom of your tool, your ruler, down the bottom of the screen, there's an open book. If you click on that, that'll give the submission number, and then you can go straight to it by just scrolling down. The wonders of technology. All right, now Jacob, you are the timekeeper, so our first submitter is ready to go, so we're in your hands to stay go. All right.
Wai ora, wai Māori, wai katoa. Rire, hau pai mā rire. Ko parihaka te maunga, ko hātia te awa, ko pehe awere te marae. Ko Ngāti Hau te hapu, ko Ngā Puhi te iwi, ko Kahukuri te tangata. Ko Laurie Brett, ahau. No whangare te ringa paraoa ahau. E te mare kura, ne rā te mihi. Your Worship, Councillors, thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the addition of fluorine to the water supply. I've been a dentist in Whangarei for 35 years and have been a keen amateur researcher of fluorine over that time. I'd like to sort of tell you about why I entered into this realm of dentistry. I think every general practitioner needs a sort of a hobby speciality to keep their interest in the game up. And I was always very keen on the chemistry at school, and when I went to university at Otago, chemistry was my topic of choice. I started doing a BSc in chemistry. 2 years into my degree, I received an invitation from the dental school to go and be a dentist. So I thought that was a pretty lucky thing to have happened to me, so I became a dentist. Quite suddenly in the course of dentistry, I realised that there was a sort of a dilemma immediately arose for me, because 2 of the sort of stock and trade chemicals in dentistry are mercury and fluorine, and in the chemistry lab, those are the 2 elements that we were particularly leery of, and were very careful in the management of them. I remember in my finals exam at the end of my degree course, when I was sitting my oral exam in preventive dentistry, the professors sitting in front of me said, "Well, why is fluoride good for you?" And I foolishly opened my mouth and said, "Well, if you don't know by now, I can't really help you." I failed that exam and had to do another term of preventive dentistry learning before they would allow me to graduate. Well, what that gave me was an even greater interest in the chemistry of fluorine, and that sort of carried me through. After a period of the obligatory OE, I returned to New Zealand, and no sooner had we come back, and I read an article in the New Zealand Herald. This would be 1977, I think. Read an article in the New Zealand Herald where the then Mayor of Auckland, Sir Dovemar Robinson, was quoting in one of his anti-fluoride speeches, and he was a passionate anti-fluoride advocate and a very feisty man to boot. He quoted a court case in Pennsylvania, one of the longest court cases in the history of the United States legislature, where the judge found that over the 10 years that fluoridation had been taking place, 10 cities without fluoride had a 5% lower incidence of cancer than 10 cities, similar cities, which were fluoridated. And the judge found in favour of the plaintiffs who were claiming that the fluoride caused the cancer. I thought that was pretty amazing, having sort of believed that fluorine was a benefit to us. And then a couple of days later in the Dominion, the Wellington paper, Professor Donald Beck, the head of preventive dentistry at the school, my professor, published an article saying that those results were invalid because there had not been a correction made for gender and age, and that therefore the whole trial was invalid. It was then debated, and it was found that in fact these adjustments had been made, and Sir Dovemeyer asked Donald Beck would he like to review his opinion in the light of the fact that those adjustments had been made. Donald Beck said, "No, I stand on my opinion, and that's that." So I thought, well, someone's wrong here. I'll find out who it is. So I wrote letters to both of them, and Donald Beck didn't reply at all. Sir Dovemeyer Robinson sent me a stack of papers this high, and I thought, oh dear. So I became a student of fluoride. One of the things that he suggested I do was to contact Dr. John Colquhoun, who had been the principal dental officer for the Auckland region, and as such in charge of the school dental nurse service, and he had access to a huge database of the school children being treated through the system, and was a staunch advocate of water fluoridation, and was in fact the New Zealand Dental Association advocate for it. Prior to going on a world tour of the fluoridated countries, he did a review of the Auckland statistics and found to his horror that the non-fluoridated areas had the better teeth. So he was a bit perturbed about that, and when he went around on his trails around the world, wherever he went, the same information was given to him. And they were saying, well, look, just keep it to yourself, but it's actually not working. So when he came back to New Zealand, he became an anti-fluoridationist. This cost him his job and his career, but I think we owe a great deal to these two brave men for having the courage to search for what we call the truth, and I've been influenced strongly by them. So by 1980 I was sceptical, to say the least, about the benefits of fluoride, and this has continued to this day, because we have things like comparisons of towns and cities that have stopped fluoridation. Timaru in 1985 stopped fluoridation, and there was a great hoo-ha about the epidemic of caries that was going to come. This is a copy of a headline that came up in 1991. For those of you who didn't read it, dental decay soars in Timaru. That is a lie. That is the press printing a lie. The dental decay rates in Timaru after fluoridation stopped reduced quite markedly, at least as rapidly as they did in fluoridated areas. We have Tauranga in 1992 ceased fluoridation. I don't have the figures available for that, but I can rest assured that if there had been an outbreak, or an epidemic as they call it, of dental decay in Tauranga following the cessation of fluoridation, well, then the Ministry of Health would have made a hue and cry about it, and would be using it as a powerful instrument to advocate for fluoridation. Ashburton in 2006, I think it was, stopped. Where's the hue and cry there? There's been none. At a national level, countries such as Cuba, Finland, Germany, Switzerland all ceased fluoridation, no increase in decay rates across the whole population of the countries. In New Zealand, we have lots of government-sponsored research carried out which tells us how wonderful the fluoride is and how especially beneficial it is for people of the lower socio-economic groups. But these are small-scale studies carried out with the bias of the operator being pro-fluoride and government-sponsored, and as it turns out, these research protocols don't really carry weight. I'd like to refer to the York report, which was an international review of water fluoridation carried out by the University of York in England in 2001. And this was a sort of first attempt to make an objective appraisal of all the information. It's like you Googled water fluoridation and analysed and studied everything that came up. There are lots of implications for New Zealand in this, and one of the members of the committee was in fact a dentist who had worked in New Zealand and was a strong advocate of fluoridation. First thing that came out of this is that there were no tests carried out for the safety of fluoride. The promoters of fluoride have not carried out any individual safety testing on the material. Secondly, the quality of research was generally poor, and that's what I've been alluding to earlier about the operator bias, no double-blind trials, and small sample sizes, all reflecting on our New Zealand situation. Thirdly, at 12 years of age, 40% of children in fluoridated areas will have fluorosis of their teeth. That's that white mottling effect that you get on your teeth. This is a direct measure of damage to the enamel of your tooth. You can't, whether it's non-damaging or cosmetic, as they say, is besides the point. The genetic structure of the tooth has been altered, and it's caused by fluorine. And this is actually a marker for damage by fluoride in the rest of your body, particularly in your bony skeleton. Fourthly, no reduction in caries. 14% maybe, but more research is needed. This is a very small amount, and I'll talk a bit more about statistics in a wee while. And fifthly, no particular benefit to the lower socio-economic groups. And the Ministry of Health in New Zealand makes a huge fuss about the fact that one of the main reasons we're putting fluoride in the water is because of our poor, our underprivileged, and dare I say it, our Polynesian community. Speaking of emotive media propaganda, have a look at this. Where are we? Here we have, this is a Queensland thing. Here we have teeth exposed to fluoridated water, and we'll all agree they're wonderful teeth, really great. There are teeth without exposure to fluoridated water. Well, if everybody who hadn't drunk water had teeth like that, I think I would immediately become an advocate of water fluoridation. This is outrageous emotional propaganda. And here's our Waikato District Health Board version of the same thing. There isn't a dentist in New Zealand who would look at that and say that decay is caused by a lack of fluoride. It's clearly established that there is no requirement for fluoride in your metabolism at all. That is baby bottle decay, which is to say the baby's crying, you stick sugar on the teat, fill the bottle, whether it's with water, fluoridated water, milk, concentrate or whatever, plug it in his mouth, her mouth, they suck on it and go to sleep with a bottle in their mouth, and that is what causes that decay. This is outrageously misleading from the Waikato DHB. I'd like to refer to the statistical side of things now. This is for Townsville in Queensland. In Townsville, here we go, 65% less tooth decay. Now that seems fantastic. I'd buy into that if that was 65%, but let's have a look what 65% actually is. And we're talking decayed, missing, filled surfaces here. And in Townsville, at age 7, they select these statistics very nicely. We have 0.09 surfaces, and in Brisbane we have 0.26. So that actually is a difference of 65%. But what it actually is in absolute terms is a difference of 0.17 of one surface of one tooth. That's the difference that fluoride makes. 65%. And the people who do these statistics and print these photos, they know what they're doing. They're deliberately deceiving. Where does the fluoride come from? I believe it's supplied by Orica here in Hamilton. Well, Orica bought the then Ferns Corporation, which was Fertiliser New Zealand Corporation, so reasonable to expect that it comes from the fertiliser industry. There are other sources, aluminium industries, all smelting industries produce fluoride residues. The fluoride that we use in New Zealand is, I think, a Category 8 poison, which is to say it's illegal to dispose of it into the waterways, into the soil, or into the atmosphere. There are limited disposal rates through the chimneys that the industry is allowed by legislation. Hamilton, I think, uses 70 tonnes a year, and of that, 98% or so is disseminated into the environment. 1% of that amount is actually drunk. So somehow or other, 70 tonnes of that toxic waste that's illegal to dispose of is being disposed of by the Hamilton District Council. Where does it go? I guess it goes into the soil. At least some of it will be going into the stormwater drains and going into the Waikato River. And I'll hold up here for you the MSDS, the Material Safety Data Sheet for hydrofluorosilicic acid. Do not allow material to enter sewer, stormwater drains or waterways. If spills enter waterways, contact regional authority. That's you guys. You are paying to dispose of a prohibited toxic waste. Speaking of drinking, this 1% that is actually drunk, and I put it to you that it's not drunk by the people who should be drinking it. They're drinking 1.5s of Coke. You see it in the street all the time. The effect, if any, is topical. That is to say, there is no benefit from ingesting fluoride. It's not strengthening the teeth by being built into them. It's weakening them, as the fluorosis shows. The benefit, and this is now clearly established, is from topical contact as it passes through your mouth. Well, it's such a low concentration for such a fleeting moment. For it to be so effective, it must be a mighty, almost a magical compound. And more studies have shown that the layer of fluoride that actually does build up on your enamel is so almost like one atom thick that it has no benefit at all. And I mean, the statistics bear this out. Which brings us to the question of toxicity. There's a raft, you'll be bombarded with data on toxicity over the next few days, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but there's a clear association with thyroid dysfunction. Iodine is required for thyroid metabolism, and fluorine is a direct antagonist to iodine, so the iodine is prevented from functioning properly in your thyroid. There's an epidemic of hypothyroidism in the United States now, it's recognised. We have arthritic changes because of fluorine reacts favourably with calcium in your skeleton, so you get calcifying lesions in your joints, and early fluorosis is typified by arthritic changes. The pineal gland in your brain is a calcifying organ and is increasingly calcified when you ingest fluorine into it. And the pineal gland is a controlling hormonal regulator and influences things like onset of puberty, which is earlier in fluoridated young women, sleep patterns, growth patterns. It's a basic hormone mediator interfered with by fluorine. You've got arterial calcifications. The plaques that you get in your aorta when you're having coronary heart disease are something like 14,000 parts per million of fluorine in them. And most disturbingly, I think, is that in China there have been over a dozen studies carried out now for many, many years about the effect of fluorine on intelligence. And they came up with the notion over many studies that IQ is diminished in a dose-related fashion to fluoride intake. Now, here in New Zealand, we all go, ha, 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 that doesn't work because they're Chinese, we don't have to pay any attention to that. But actually, the Harvard University, probably the most prestigious university in the world, has come on board with this now. They reviewed that research and have come out and said the same thing. Fluoride diminishes intelligence. We're talking about dose and toxicity again. At 0.7 to 1 part per million is considered to be the ideal concentration of the fluorine in your water supply. But what about the dose? How do you regulate dose? If you drink twice as much water as the next person, when I was a student, 2 parts per million was considered to be the therapeutic dose. So if you drink, and now 2 parts per million is acknowledged as being a toxic dose. So if you drink twice as much water as the next person, have you reached that level where you've got the equivalent of 2 parts per million in your dosage? What if you're a performance athlete or a thirsty man, If you're drinking a lot of water, you are conceivably breaching the safe levels of ingestion. Another issue too is this idea of toxic dose as opposed to therapeutic dose. If 1 part per million is safe and 2 parts per million isn't, that's a toxic dose, therapeutic dose ratio of 1 to 2. If you're testing a medicine and intending to release it for public consumption, that ratio has to be at least 100 to 1. So that you are breaching your therapeutic dose levels all the time. Finally, it's a right to choose. The onus is on the purveyors to prove safety, not for us to prove that it's not safe. Council is not responsible for the health of the community. The council has got other jobs far more important to do that. And in closing, I'd just like to say that in New Plymouth and Waipukaro, when they removed the fluorine from there, the local newspapers released identical press statements which went basically like this: Council has decided to cease fluoridation as of such and such a date. However, we will continue to fluoridate the water supplies until the stocks are run out because there's no other safe way of disposing of it. Nō reira, ka rere tono ngā mihi pera ano ki te waia o e katoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrew Harms, who's come all the way from Adelaide. He's the ex-president of the South Australian Dental Association and will give his perspective on industrial fluoridation.
No, we can't change the lines, unfortunately. Thank you very much. My turning point in looking at the issue of industrial water fluoridation came about 12 years ago when I parted company with my prostate and a few other bits and pieces and lymph nodes, and I had a little bit of time to convalesce. And I was looking originally at instigating a project trying to get our South Australian Dental Association to adopt Victoria's voluntary code of mercury disposal because I was concerned about waste disposal. And I realised the more I looked at the dental industry that our bigger problem was fluoridation, and particularly the use of industrial chemicals to fluoridate our water supplies. It came as quite a shock to me that, so I'll just try and get this. It came as quite a shock to me because I'd come through dental school in Adelaide University. I'm, like Laurie, I'm an ex-military dentist. I started out in science. I was invited to join the dental faculty in second year. So I have a very similar sort of background and interest in biochemistry. When I realised the issue of fluoridation, that we were obtaining our fluoride supplies from industrial waste, I was quite shocked. So really what we've been doing all this time has been ignoring the fact that we are using an industrial waste mainly from the superphosphate industry instead of natural calcium fluoride. And there are vast differences between the two approaches. And the original studies supporting the use of natural fluoride were based on calcium fluoride out of well water and natural sources. So we're fluoridating at the moment at the rate of around about 800 tonnes per million people. In Adelaide, it took us a long time. It took me a long time to get access to the records and under freedom of information of what we are actually doing. And now, at the present time in South Australia, most of our industrial waste that we use is being imported either from Belgium or China. Originally, we were using waste from a superphosphate plant in Geelong. So why is there such a push to fluoridate? Firstly, the initial push came from industry wanting to find a way of getting rid of their chemicals. Dentists feel they're doing us a good turn by having a major public health issue that they can claim as their own. The sugar industry had a large part in the funding of this, and I would think the impact of sugar on teeth is our biggest problem in dentistry, not a lack of fluoride. And in fact, I don't believe that there is a safe dose of fluoride, and I don't think that dental decay, caries, is caused by a lack of fluoride. Caries is a bacterial infection of your teeth. The council today, New Zealand councils are faced with a few options. We can cease industrial fluoridation. We could move to pharmaceutical grade calcium fluoride with a lot less impact on the health and on the environment. And the third issue is that now that the knowledge is out there and the studies are well established and there are issues with health and safety, the councils really have to look at the idea of, or the fact that they've got to indemnify now, and there is some responsibility to what we're doing to our environment and to the people. So these adverse health impacts can't be ignored any longer. And council has a responsibility to their people to face up to that. And are you prepared to, if you continue fluoridation, to indemnify and take responsibility for what you're doing to the people of your community? Under freedom of information, we managed eventually, after many years, to get a copy of the breakdown of the chemical analysis. This was from the Geelong plant. The one that really interests me is arsenic that we get in our chemicals. We also get cadmium, chromium, a bit of mercury. Some of them they list, and these sheets, by the way, vary month to month. Wide variations in the so-called contaminants or co-products that we get in our fluoride. Sometimes on the analysis sheets you'll see aluminium, sometimes you'll see uranium. On this particular example, that's not shown, of course, but I have concerns with beryllium, cadmium, and others. When we look at arsenic, arsenic is of concern to me. 90% of the arsenic that we get in tap water in fluoridated areas comes from these fluoridation chemicals. A recent study, only published last month, has looked at a comparison, for the first time that I've ever seen, of if we went to chemicals, the hydrofluorosilicic acid, which is the group of, the broad term for the group of chemicals that we use in industrial fluoridation, and even if we went to pharmaceutical grade sodium fluoride. The authors here, just I digress a little bit, Bill Gallagher I've met in Canada. he and Rob Carlton, as head of the senior leaders and scientists in the EPA in America, went to Congress in 2004 and gave evidence that fluoride itself should be listed as a carcinogen. That's been ignored so far due to the politics of the whole issue. So what they found was that if we moved to pharmaceutical grade, the deaths would be a lot less from cancers, and by a factor of about 12. And in the United States, there'd be a saving of $1 to $5 billion American dollars annually. And if you extrapolate that to this council area, hey, 1 or 2 deaths, does that matter? I think it does. I think every life is precious. And the fact that we're all being forced in fluoridated communities to drink arsenic is unacceptable. And it doesn't make any sense, bearing in mind that we're not seeing a benefit in terms of the dental industry. In Adelaide, we have the Colgate Centre, the Australian Research Centre for Population Oral Health, which is probably one of the main instigators or the main proponents of fluoridation in Australia. This slide, I think, should, and I've taken data from this centre, this slide should finish fluoride as a systemic fluoride in fluoridation. I'll go back a little bit. This is the decay, roughly the decay index. These are the states and territories. And on the bottom graph, I've lined up percentage of fluoridation. So most states are fluoridated for many years, since about 1970. Queensland only Townsville until recent times. Now, if there was a benefit to fluoride for all these different age groups, if there was a benefit, we would expect to see a change in this area here in Queensland. But there's nothing. There's no bounce effect from fluoridation. There's just a flat line. And in fact, in a lot of the studies, you'll find that the state that's been fluoridated the longest, which is Tasmania, has generally higher decay rates in a lot of the smaller studies. So this graph should call us to question the whole philosophy of fluoridation. When we look at the funding of the Colgate Centre, well, we call it the Colgate Centre, the Archpo Centre, we see clearly here government and Colgate. And when we look at some of the data that comes out of some of these studies, the National Survey of Adult Oral Health, and we compare, I put all those groups together from that study into one group of over 15 years of age, and we see a 2% difference between fluoridated South Australian data and non-fluoridated Queensland. If we go to children, we do see an effect. Okay, about 23%. A lot of studies will show in 12-year-olds 25 to 30% difference comparing national average to a non-fluoridated state like Queensland. So why do we see that? And I don't want to go into, there's not the scope and the time to go into it, but the principal reason we see this 25-30% difference in 12-year-olds is because of delayed tooth eruption. And there are really good studies now showing us of the 1 to 2 year delay in tooth eruption, which is manifest mainly in the 12-year data. And we see patterns like this very commonly, where teeth are impacted and jammed because baby teeth aren't coming out. Once again, another slide. I won't go into this in too much detail, but the point is delayed tooth eruption is skewing all the data. In 2003, there was a study done comparing fluoridated children, mainly from Western Australia, to South Australian data. And over the period of 40 years, in the time of fluoridation in both communities, there's been a delay in tooth eruption, which is manifest, purporting to show a reduction in early childhood tooth decay in the 12-year-old group. This is profound, absolutely profound. So what do we see in children? We see in fluoridated children we see teeth that haven't erupted and primary teeth still in place. So what we should be comparing is 12-year-olds non-fluoridated to 13-year-olds fluoridated, and then we do see that there is no difference in decay. Laurie mentioned childhood caries, early childhood caries, bottle caries. This is the problem, not lack of fluoride. In Adelaide we have about 700 cases requiring general anaesthesia to remove teeth, and it's pretty shocking. Fluoride has no impact on that. We also see a concept which is widely described in the dental profession as fluoride bombs, where we look at teeth like this, person comes in with a toothache, and often it's missed, it's very difficult to pick up. What's happening is the enamel, due to systemic fluorides, is very brittle, but the dentine underneath, the layer beneath the enamel, is more permeable to bacteria, so you get a cap of brittle enamel with runaway decay underneath. We pop a drill in there, we open it up, and we see mush underneath. Very often that leads, in this situation, say, to either root canal and a crown, or we pop the tooth out, which is quite tragic. And so this also delays the onset of recognition of tooth decay. Some of this work is from Professor Hardy Lineback, who's the Professor of Preventive Dentistry in Toronto University. So I would credit this slide. These last three aren't mine. He's looked at the change in the tooth structure, particularly the dentine, the layer beneath the enamel, which is the bulk of the tooth, and they found an increase in the tubular size, these little tubules that carry the little nerve endings, and the bacteria deeper into the tooth. And all these changes occur underneath the enamel, and then we see more fractures and breakdown. So we have delayed decay recognition, but often worse problems, and they mimic some of the osteoporosis changes we see in bone. There's been an enormous effort in Australia to sanitise fluoride and maintain the rage that fluoride is safe and effective and there's no problems. And this is, I think, a classic example of disinformation. Department of Human Services, the Cancer Council and Victorian Government, we know that, and this is looking at osteosarcoma, which is a pretty tragic sort of bone cancer. What we know is, and there's good studies from Harvard, the classic Basson study back in 2000, found that if children consume in their primary years fluoridated water, then in their secondary years, say 11 to 19, the rate of bone cancer, osteosarcoma, is increased fivefold. So in order to try and overcome that, what do? Instead of saying, hey, we might have a problem, children might be dying of bone cancer, let's give the people some statistics. So they take this group of stats. The purpose is to provide a balanced evidence. Well, that's just not true. It's not balanced. They take children only under 15 instead of taking the 11 to 19 year group, which is the group that the Basson studies recognised as a very landmark study. They say there's only a few cases a year, so we won't worry about those few kids who die. And we'll lump all the statistics together and we'll put boys and girls together, because this effect of osteosarcoma only occurs in teenage boys. For some reason, girls aren't affected. This slide also should make us question the sense of fluoridation. If we look at this slide, World Health Organisation data, 12-year-olds going back from pre-fluoride days, there's been a general trend to decrease and a decrease in tooth decay rates. We look at the fluoridated countries, non-fluoridated countries, and they all plummet down. So people can say in New Zealand, they could make the statement that, look, tooth decay rates have dropped in New Zealand because of fluoride. Sure, decay rates have dropped. Due to fluoride, no. And this sort of graph is just amazing. When I first saw this graph, I was just absolutely shocked, absolutely stunned. What I think here is important in this slide is the word money. There's a lot of money in this. and it's a battle that's been going for many years. But I think genuine science needs to be upheld, not spin. Thank you.
So I'm all ready to go from this push. Okay. So that's it. You finished a bit sooner. So just bear for me a moment. Okay. Your Worship, councillors, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Peter Scanlon, and I apologise that I have to sit down, but I've sustained an injury to my leg. Should Hamilton City Council continue to add hydrofluoric acid to its drinking water? And I've subtitled it The Poverty of High-Level Science to Inform Decision Makers. And you have a big decision before you as to whether to continue to add this particular substance or to stop it. And I would promote the latter. My interest in this began about several years ago when I was trying to work out what was behind a couple of my children's learning disabilities and behavioural issues, and I realised that fluoridation could be a factor, and for the last 3.5 years I've spent a lot of time studying this. I have a background history of a science degree for Victoria University in Wellington in animal and human physiology, did my basic medical training at Auckland University, and currently I'm a fellow of the College of Urgent Care Physicians, and I work locally. Evidence-based decision making. How good should the evidence be for adding hydrofluoric acid? I don't envy you. There's masses of info. I've poured over hundreds of papers over the past 3.5 years, and the evidence that I've looked at is really of low quality, and it should be of the highest standard. It should be the best quality. Water fluoridation affects practically everyone, young and old, because there's ubiquitous exposure, unless you have a bit of money to get it out of your system with reverse osmosis and certain filters. If you look at that picture there, there's a tablet that's weighing up the risk and the benefits. The benefits are actually pretty marginal. The New Zealand Oral Health Survey tells us that 1.6 surfaces of a tooth difference relative to the fluoridated and non-fluoridated areas. And to me, that's not enough. 1.6 out of a total of 128 tooth surfaces is 1.25% absolute difference. And I think that's minimal. The other problem too is the only risk that seems to be studied is the dental risk, dental fluorosis, and I think there are other possible risks, and we'll look at some of those. And any potential risk or real risk should trump any marginal benefit. We've also had speakers talk about the York Review, and that was the first decent, objective, scientific study. What quality of evidence is this for the adding of hydrofluoric acid to Hamilton's water supply? Well, this particular systematic review of all the evidence, and it was published in 2000, graded the information and the evidence and did a critical qualitative assessment. There are many different grading systems and hierarchies of levels of evidence. I like the semantic one that I've just put up there on the screen. Level A, highest quality of evidence, minimal risk of bias. Level B, evidence of moderate quality, moderate risk of bias. And C, which is lowest quality of evidence and high risk of bias. There are no level A studies. That's shocking. Most of the evidence for benefit and harm is either level B or level C, and in this systematic review they excluded all level C studies. The 4 papers mentioned by the New Zealand Oral Health Survey in 2009, 4 local papers, 2 from Auckland, 1 from Southland, and the so-called Denison Lee, Christchurch and Wellington study would have all been excluded as being level C, lowest quality of evidence, high risk of bias. So, there isn't much evidence for this country's support of this by the ministry. Professor Trevor Sheldon was surprised at how low the quality of studies was, and he said the evidence was insufficient quality to allow confident statements and about other harms such as bone cancer and bone fractures. The amount and quality of available data on side effects were insufficient to rule out all but the biggest of effects. So we're dealing with really low quality data, which is not a good thing when you're going to make really important decisions. There's not enough data to actually inform policy, let alone decisions for councils to continue fluoridating. So you have to weigh the options. With regards to the evidence, grade A should actually include randomised controlled trials. They're the gold standard of assessing safety and benefits for medical treatments, and I'll explain shortly why I believe fluoride is a medicine. But this is a good objective summary that was published by Beckham in 2012 in a peer-reviewed article, which I gave you. The key problem is that of a lack of good quality evidence of both effectiveness and harm. A more balanced reading of the evidence is that water fluoridation has little effect, is a poor delivery mechanism, causes dental fluorosis, and may have long-term harmful effects. Fluoride is effective when applied topically, but is potentially harmful when ingested. So, what is water fluoridation? The Ministry of Health tells us that water fluoridation is a process of adjusting the natural level of fluoride in the water supply between 0.7 and 1 part per million, which is, you can also use the unit milligrams per litre. This is the optimal amount that provides protection against tooth decay. The amount added is monitored to make sure the levels stay within that range. The next question I would like to ask is fluoride added to the water a chemical additive? We add chlorine or chloramine as disinfectant agents, and they have a purpose to clean the water and inactivate microorganisms. Fluoride is not there to treat the water, it's there for another purpose. Is the fluoride added to water a supplement? No, because fluoride is added to water to protect teeth by preventing dental decay. Caries or tooth decay is a chronic infectious disease. The fluoride is added to be at an optimal level to prevent tooth decay. That is the purpose of putting it into the water. Fluoride is added for a therapeutic purpose, and the dietary supplement regulations for this country say that you don't have a supplement if it's recommended for a therapeutic purpose. Is the added fluoride a medicine? Well, according to sections 3 and 4 of the Medicines Act 1981, the term medicine means any substance or article other than a medical device that is manufactured, imported, sold, or supplied wholly or principally for administering to one or more human beings for a therapeutic purpose. And they define the term therapeutic purpose as including treating or preventing disease, preventing or interfering with the normal operation of physiological function, whether permanently or temporarily, and whether by way of terminating or reducing or postponing or increasing or accelerating the operation of that function or in any other way. So it modifies physiological functions. Well, guess what the mechanism of fluoride's action on teeth is? One of the physiological processes that occurs is remineralization and mineralization, demineralization. They're physiological processes. The fluoride inhibits demineralization when present in solution. It enhances mineralization. And fluoride inhibits plaque bacteria. So it fulfills the two parts of the definition of therapeutic purpose. For MedSafe, which is New Zealand's medicines and medical products regulatory safe authority, for MedSafe, is fluoride that is swallowed a related product, or is it a medicine? What's a related product? It's a product that's primarily a food, dentifrice, fancy word for toothpaste, or cosmetic, but has a secondary therapeutic use. Toothpaste is a related product because its primary purpose is cleaning the teeth. And so they put labels on toothpaste: do not swallow and do not use this product in children 6 years of age or less. So swallowing it would make it a medicine. Not swallowing it makes it a related product. And it's very interesting that for MedSafe, I asked this question: is fluoride that is swallowed a related product or medicine? There's, in the New Zealand Regulatory Guidelines for Medicines, on page 2, by MedSafe, they note that fluoride mouthwashes that are also intended to be swallowed as a supplement are medicines. So adding fluoride to drinking water supplies fluoride that is swallowed. That is a medicine for a therapeutic purpose to prevent tooth decay. And giving it to a whole lot of people once using water as a vehicle makes it mass medication. If it's a medicine, then it should be regulated, but it isn't. If adding fluoride to water is a medicine, then evidence on its effect should be subject to the standards of proof expected of drugs, including evidence from randomised trials, the gold standard. If used as a mass preventive measure in well people, the evidence of the net benefit should be greater than that needed for drugs to treat illness. There have been no randomised trials of water fluoridation. There are no high-quality, low-bias studies. And this is from the British Medical Journal, one of the most reputable journals in the world. This is not pseudoscience. More interesting is if there happens to be any aluminium around, and I'll talk about where some of the exposures may be. If you have aluminium around, it interacts with fluoride, and it acts like a medicine. Aluminium fluoride causes this thing called G protein coupled receptor activation. Now, these G proteins, if you see the diagram, there's a molecular picture there, molecular switches that are on that go across the actual cell membrane, and they regulate a whole lot of really important cell processes, and they control cell-to-cell interaction. 50 to 60% of the current drugs target or act via G protein coupled receptors. And aluminium fluoride is a brain toxin, a neurotoxin. G protein signaling pathways are involved in all major disease areas: cardiovascular, metabolic, neurodegenerative, psychiatric, cancer, and infectious disease. And I believe there's some recent studies showing it's now vitally important for the regulation of embryonic stem cells and embryonic development, and that is a serious area that needs vital research to see whether the fluoride in our water interacting with possible other exposures to aluminium in pregnancy or early in life may be contributing to some problems, which I'll discuss later. So, What about fluoride this interactivity with aluminium? The US Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry in 2004, they recommended that because of the additivity of fluoride to other compounds that may lead to additive interactions, fluoride should be assumed as a public health protective measure in exposure-based assessments of health hazards from exposure to mixtures of fluoride compounds. There is a wide use of fluoride, aluminium in industry, agricultural and medicine that exposes us to many increased body loads. It's in all sorts of things: aluminium pots, foil wrapped food, beverages in cans. The phosphoric acid of Coke cans will actually leach the aluminium from the wars. Aluminium is added to anti-caking agents, antiperspirants, bleaching agents in white flour, cake mixes, cigarette filters, soy formula has high levels, but now they're strongly regulated. They weren't in the past. Numerous medicines, buffered aspirin, antacids. There are welding and smelter occupational exposures. Aluminium is ubiquitous, and if it interacts with your drinking water, it'll be acting like a medicine on your G protein coupled receptors. Our ministry doesn't see it as a medicine. Why have most European countries stopped adding fluoride to their water? Well, 98% of Western continental Europe has rejected, banned or stopped fluoridation due to environmental, health, legal, ethical concerns. Some saw it as unethical, like the Czech Republic. They saw it as a forced medication. Belgium, drinking water sector, it is not the task to deliver medicinal treatment to people. Germany, it is not the task of water supply companies to add substances to drinking water intended as prophylactics against illnesses not caused by drinking water. It's a medicine, it's a drug. So, who is responsible? Who is prescribing an unregulated medicine with no control over the dosage, no control? When I prescribe drugs, I take into account the body weight, the age, any comorbidities or conditions, illnesses like liver disease, kidney disease. It's not the Ministry of Health, it's not Orica, it's not the Waikato District Health Board, it's you guys. What a heavy responsibility, because you're not trained. Why is fluoride now being called a nutrient? Well, I think it's because certain people don't want to call it a medicine. What is a nutrient? From the Latin, that food that nourishes, nutrients. A nutrient is a chemical substance that provides nourishment and affects the nutritive and metabolic processes of the body. Nutrients are essential for growth, reproduction, and maintenance of health. Do we need it? Is it a vital, essential nutrient? Well, if there are nutrient deficiency states, yes, you need it. If you're low in iron, you need iron. But there is no known fluoride deficiency state that exists in humans. Dental caries or tooth decay is not a fluoride deficiency state. You could have perfectly healthy, non-decayed teeth without it, and healthy bones. Fluoride content of the body is not under physiological control, European Food Safety Authority wrote in 2005. Important stuff, important nutrients are under tight physiological body control. Fluoride is not an essential element for human growth and development and for most organisms in the environment. From the European Union's Scientific Committee on Health and Environment Risks in 2011. Fluoride is not in any natural human metabolic pathway. So why does the New Zealand Ministry of Health think fluoride is a nutrient? I can find two references. It seems to appear in the nutrient reference values for Australia and New Zealand 2006 and in the Food Standards Australia-New Zealand report. And they seem to have derived it from a US and Canadian report that was done and published in 1997. The recommendations for fluoride were primarily derived from the review of the dietary reference intakes for calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, vitamin D, really important nutrients, real nutrients. And this odd fellow, fluoride, was added there. The politics that influence science, bad science. Okay, that report stemmed from the Institute of Medicine in America. Is fluoride an essential nutrient? A whole bunch of learned scientists got a bit upset and wrote to the president of the IOM and to the president of the National Academy of Sciences in the US about their concerns to this new status and why was it included in that report. And the letter that they were sent back is this. Nowhere in the report is it stated that fluoride is an essential nutrient, as was stated the recommended dietary allowances 10th edition, which we published in 1989. These contradictory results do not justify a classification of fluoride as an essential element according to accepted standards, scientific standards. Nonetheless, because of its valuable effects on dental health, fluoride is a beneficial element for human. There's this dental bias that sort of clouds our thinking about what is really a nutrient and what isn't. Is fluoride a nutrient? You have to look at the historical perspective to understand this. In the 1950s, dentists believed fluoride was a nutrient. And they believed that ingestion was during pregnancy, at birth and childhood was necessary for growing strong, healthy, good teeth. Fluoride deficiency was believed to cause cavities. Anti-caries or poor dental tooth decay effects were due to the incorporation of systemically, that means it gets into your bloodstream through swallowing it, fluoride, and it occurred in it affected the pre-eruptive teeth, the teeth before they came out. Look at this quote from a learned dental researcher. And the buzzword is belief. On the basis of the belief that an adequate intake of fluoride in early life is protective against caries in later life, fluoride supplements are recommended for infants and children living in areas in which fluoride content of the drinking water is low. Wonderful belief. Beliefs are great. There's an ad there from Time about 19,000 dentists advising a certain brand of cigarettes in the Time magazine in 1950. The doctors were just as bad. They had the same sort of ads. Okay, so what about prenatal fluoride use? Used before a baby's born and during the pregnancy. You have to go back historically. This is what was written in 1967 by one researcher in the dental field. The recommendation for their use during pregnancy has been based on the lack of evidence indicating harmful effects to the mother or developing fetus and the prospect that benefits may accrue to the child's deciduous teeth. They didn't look for any. They didn't know. And they had this false belief that it actually worked. So, is fluoride during pregnancy another debunked myth? Well, another debunked myth for any dental benefit. The first decent study that I could find showing that there was no real dental benefit for taking it during pregnancy was Leverett and colleagues in 1997. They did a randomised double-blind clinical trial with 1,400 pregnant women. Half were given 1 milligram fluoride daily for 6 months and the other half given a placebo. They followed children up to the age of 5 and they found no difference in tooth decay rates. It took decades to show there was no dental benefit. But what about the adverse effects? They didn't look. They haven't looked. It's assumptions. What does prenatal fluoride do to the growing baby in the womb? They had these old assumptions, like the placenta acting as a barrier. We know that's not true, fluoride crosses. That the child was genetically hardwired and resilient. We now know that environmental stresses and certain chemicals can cause software program changes that cause hardware malfunction of the body system in the unborn that manifest years later. They would only have looked for structural, obvious things you can see visually damaged, that's teratogenic damage. They didn't have the technology to look for functional damage. So everything looks fine, but things don't work properly. They thought the exposure dose for fluoride was too low for any effects. They didn't have this idea of or know when the blood-brain barrier, special barrier that prevents certain chemicals getting in and damaging, harming the brain, when that matured, doesn't mature to about 6 weeks of age, and in premature babies takes longer, so their brains are more vulnerable to fluoride doses. And they didn't really understand when the fetal thyroid matured and the dependence on the mother and how interactions with fluoride in pregnancy may have profound effects on the brain of the developing child, especially if the mother has subclinical hypothyroidism. They will get irreversible IQ deficits. They didn't know much, and they made all these assumptions that it was actually safe. So, fluoride prescription practice changed with time too. So I've moved from the baby, now it's moved, from the unborn child now to infancy. In the 1950s to 1979, 0.5 milligram per day was recommended to be a supplement to be taken if your child was growing up in an area with low fluoride. They changed it in 1979, and it's to a level of, we reduced it to 1/4 of a milligram for breast or bottle-fed babies if they were in fluoride-deficient areas of less than 0.3 parts per million, and made it 0 for formula-fed babies, particularly if it was, that was a concern of the introduction of bottle-fed babies growing on that particular time. So that was a concern of dose. They adjusted it. And then in 1994, they wrote, these are the major organisations, the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and other various institutions and organisations around. They said no oral fluoride from birth to 6 months of age, irrespective of whether in a high or low water deficient, fluoride deficient area. So no fluoride for the first 6 months. This is a guideline, a best practice from 2009, New Zealand guideline based on some recommendation in 2001 on the Ministry of Health. If you look from birth to 0 to 3 years, either non-fluoridated, partially fluoridated or fluoridated, the recommendation is no fluoride, okay? And the key reason was because of increased risk of dental fluorosis, but they didn't look at any other bodily changes, which concerns me. In infancy and toddlers now, is there really an optimal dose and the recommended dose to prevent dental fluorosis is believed to be 0.5 to 0.7 milligrams of fluoride per kilogram of body weight. The optimal dose, I just said ago, for oral ingested fluoride from birth to age 3 is 0. The Iowa fluoride study, a longitudinal study that followed kids from 6 weeks of age through to, in this particular study, till they were older, 9 years of age, they found there was difficulty in estimating total fluoride intake from food, beverages, toothpaste, water. And they concluded, thus it is doubtful that parents or clinicians could adequately track children's fluoride intake and compare it with the recommended level, rendering the concept of an optimal or target dose relatively moot. Look at that kid over there, all that toothpaste. How much has he consumed or swallowed? I've got kids that used to drink the stuff, and you know, some estimates are about 1/3, and but some kids drink more than others, and some don't spit out, and many parents don't have time to supervise their kids. These kids are getting excessive fluoride dosages. Okay. Was the safety and effectiveness of infant fluoride dosage schedule ever tested? Now, I'm going to quote this paper because it's really important. The 1994 dosage schedule has not been tested in controlled clinical trials, those grade A high quality ones, to ascertain whether it is the correct balance today for maximal karyostatic effectiveness with minimal risk of producing dental fluorosis. But the same caveat applied to previous dosage schedules for fluoride supplements, which date back to 1958. What is known is that an enormous body of research supports the value of the use of dietary fluoride supplements as a method of protection against the development of dental decay in areas with fluoride-deficient water supplies. They didn't have a clue. They didn't look. They didn't do high-quality testing. They made all these assumptions, and those same statements are used today by the Ministry of Health. Why not do a high-quality, low-bias, randomised controlled trial to see if fluoride is actually safe and effective? Take the example of calcium supplements. They were taken as being good for your bones, particularly in osteoporosis prevention. Now safety is coming under scrutiny, and it was kick-started by a randomised controlled trial by some local Kiwis in Auckland, Bollard and colleagues, who found it may actually be bad for your heart. There were increased risk of getting stroke and heart attacks. And then there were a whole lot of more randomised controlled trials and a meta-analysis done. And their last conclusion, 2012, Reed and Bollard from Auckland University, now consistent evidence that calcium supplements do more harm than good and that other interventions are preferable for reducing osteoporotic bones. There are no high-quality randomised controlled trials for the use of fluoride. It's belief versus scientific evidence. I talk about all those historical beliefs, they still persist. There was a paradigm shift, and it took decades to occur when there was the amount of evidence pointed to the fact that fluoride did not need to be actually incorporated. It worked topically into the teeth pre-eruptively. So here's a statement from Featherstone, I believe he's a New Zealand dental researcher. Until recently, the major caries inhibitory effect of fluoride was thought to be due to its incorporation in tooth mineral during the development of the tooth prior to eruption. There is now overwhelming evidence that the primary caries preventative mechanisms of action are post-eruptive through topical effects for both children and adults. The majority of dentists, I've met some, they still believe, they think it's incorporated in the teeth. This is a study done in America. A majority of dentists and dental hygienists thought fluoride worked through the pre-eruptive incorporation into the enamel. We gave to all these pregnant women, we gave to these young babies, and they didn't need it. And we don't know what it does to their other body systems other than their teeth with respect to the only fact that what we've looked at is dental fluorosis. So, why should I swallow fluoridated water? In this picture here, you have a baby looking at his grandmum. I ain't got no teeth, neither have I. They don't need it. But what about formula-fed babies, fully formula-fed babies and infants? Are they being overdosed at the concentrations that are being put into our water? There was a study done by Cressy, a New Zealander, and this is what he said. The mean estimated dietary fluoride intake for formula-fed babies from 0 to 6 months in New Zealand using fluoridated water at a concentration of 0.7 milligrams is 0.66 milligrams per day, and at 1 milligram per litre it's 0.91. But I just showed you all those recommendations and guidelines. Oral fluoride ingestion from birth to 6 months of age should be 0, irrespective of the water fluoride concentration. And then Cressy uses this idea, at water fluoride concentrations of 0.7 to 1 milligram per litre, the upper limit, I'll talk about it in a minute, would be exceeded 30% and 93% of the time respectively. Now, there's a problem. The problem is upper limit has different meanings to different people. The highest average means the highest average daily nutrient intake level likely to pose no adverse health effects to almost all individuals in the general population. He did a desktop study. It was theoretical estimates. He didn't go out and actually measure what these kids have been exposed to. And the upper limits belong to the land of dental assumptions, because the value in America, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, they believe the upper limit should be 0.023 milligrams per kilogram per day. I've converted the New Zealand, the nutrient reference value for Aussie and New Zealand. It's 0.1 milligram per kilogram per day. And the Environmental Protection Agency in 2010 put their upper limit as 0.06 milligrams per kilogram per day. They're based on different assumptions. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry looked for non-cancer effects on the bone, and that's why they had a different safety factor. So theirs is actually really low, 0.023. New Zealand's one's really high, 0.1. They're based on guesses, and the science behind them is very weak. So we're putting our kids at risk based on some assumptions. So I'll give you an example. The Irish did the same sort of analysis, and their experts found that actually infants, particularly from birth to 4 months of age, were getting excessive amounts of oral fluoride. Why did the Food and Safety Authority of Ireland issue a warning for formula-fed infants and then retract it? The scientific committee agrees that the precautionary principle should apply and recommends that infant formula should not be reconstituted with fluoridated water. They put out that note. They retracted shortly after. And the Irish Times has a commentary from one of the Irish MPs who quoted, "This is clearly a pivotal matter, as even those who came before the committee admitted that had the initial report been approved, it would have meant the end of water fluoridation in Ireland." Politics influencing science. So, where do they get this average intake and this upper limit for babies, and this idea that it's a nutrient? And I've found it fascinating. The adequate intake, dietary intake for the supposed nutrient was based on the composition of breast milk from healthy mothers using a standard volume. However, I found papers in the 80s saying that fluoride in breast milk was a chemical contaminant. And the papers were looking at other contaminants like cadmium and lead, which incidentally are found in the bones and the teeth. But they started calling it a nutrient. And they looked at there are very low fluoride levels in naturally occurring breast milk. In unfluoridated regions, 0.004 milligrams per litre. In fluoridated areas, 0.01. And they used the 0.01 for the dietary recommendation. But mum's breast milk likes to keep fluoride out of it. So if you increase the fluoride that the mother has, there's a physiological barrier that tries to keep it low in the breast milk. And in some other studies, they've found that infants were actually excreting in their urine far more amounts of fluoride than they were ingesting, that they had accumulated in the womb, telling me that this stuff the body does not want, particularly in a growing baby's body. If you look at the rates of breastfeeding, they're pretty lousy. And Maori and Pacific Islanders, within the first 6 weeks of life, there's only 58% to 53% that are exclusively breastfeeding, and that drops by 6 months to 17% and 18%. There's a lot of babies being exposed to fluoride in their water. But you've got to consider other factors. Cressy's studies didn't make the assumption. I met a Maori grandmother who was looking after her grandchild, and she was bottle feeding with formula, reconstituting it with fluoridated tap water from Hamilton. Her jug had broken down. She was using a pot. I didn't ask at the time. But I found this fascinating study in 1975 that if you boil fluoridated water in Teflon, and the concentration was 1 milligram, you end up with 3 milligrams per fluoride, 3 milligrams per litre of fluoride. It almost triples the dose. And the interesting stuff was aluminium. It looks less. Aluminium goes down. That's because aluminium fluoride forms. Whether it's in the mixture, which would be really dangerous for the babies with respect to that G protein coupled receptor stuff I talked about earlier, or whether it's on the wall, no one's ascertained. They knew that in 1975. These kids are getting a massive dose, and that was not taken into consideration for the New Zealand food safety authorities, regulations and standards. So let me summarise this bit about infant exposure. Fluoride is excluded from the breast milk. Fluoride is not a nutrient. Ingested fluoride provides no pre-eruptive benefit. The optimal dose is 0. Formula made with fluoridated water provides an unsafe dose. Can the Hamilton City Council provide a safe dosage for all bottle-fed infants, including women that are using their pots to boil the water? Safety testing for this age group has not been done for hydroxysilicic acid. No one can say fluoride is safe and effective for this age group. There may be many uncertain long-term adverse health effects. This is an unregulated, unethical experiment without the informed consent of the children and parents. And to make things worse, what are we actually putting into our drinking water in Hamilton? Not naturally occurring calcium fluoride. In the picture there, I could grab that powder off my hands. It won't cause any problems. Synthetic sodium fluoride, no. That's been used as rat poison. It's been used as medication for osteoporosis and for treating hypothyroid people in the 20s, 30s, and 1940s. There's some synthetic man-made sodium fluoride. More toxic, much more toxic than calcium fluoride if you look at acute toxicity. And then you've got hydroxysilicic acid, which is a synthetic hazardous industrial waste. You cannot hold that in your hands. It will burn. It's a dangerous poison under Australian classification. That's the stuff we're putting in our water. So somewhere along the line, we used to use sodium fluoride in this city and then changed it to hydroxysilicic acid. They did the same thing in America decades ago. This is a fascinating comment. In 1950, when they changed it in America, why the substitution? They were substituted for sodium fluoride in 1947 and endorsed in 1950 by the US Public Health Service without any prior animal testing. We'll just give it to the humans. Because rats' teeth got as much fluoride as from sodium fluoride, and a community could save 4 cents per year per resident. We use it because it's cheaper. Money, money, money. Okay, what toxicological and safety data is lacking for hydroxysilicic acid? It was banned by the European Commission in 2006 because of inadequate safety and toxicological data. because it was a biocide. It's a substance that causes harm to organisms by biological chemical means. What they say they wanted, they didn't have any developmental toxicity studies. What happens to their growing unborn babies? Carcinogenicity studies, cancer causing, does it cause cancer, or teratogenic effects, ecoic toxicity, is it toxic to animals or the environment? There are no chronic long-term effects studies on humans. There are no biodegradation studies. We don't have that info, yet we use it as though it's wonderfully safe. Does hydrofluoric acid completely dissociate to free fluoride ion in drinking water? That is a question of dispute. We need more science. The current analytical methodologies are not yet available to accurately measure or quantify complexes or how much the fluoride interacts with other substances like aluminium. There's incomplete dissociation in the stomach's pH and in acidic beverages. There's assumptions made it dissociates freely into fluoride ion. It doesn't. We don't quite know. And some studies in America by Copland and Masters found that hydrofluoric acid was different to sodium fluoride, and that increased the blood lead levels in children and the lead uptake into calcified tissues. And there have been some more recent animal studies showing it does get into the teeth and it does get into the brain. And the other problem too is it interferes with certain enzymes that are really important for the developing nervous system, what they call the cholinergic system. It inhibits an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, but I won't go into that, it's a little bit complicated. So, what are the potential health risks to formula-fed infants with excessive fluoride? Dental fluorosis is the only one that's really been studied. There's effects on growing brain and neurodevelopment and lower IQ, mainly based on animal research, which is what they should be doing before giving it to humans. And it lowers IQ. The studies are done in countries where fluoride that is naturally occurring is a problem. China, India. Has not been done in any developed countries. They're ignoring it. They don't want to look for other effects. Thyroid effects, abnormal pineal gland function, bone effects. There's some interesting stuff. Some of the molecular mechanisms for toxicity of fluoride could be implicated in the development, being a developmental risk for obesity and diabetes. That's really new. I won't go into that. But concepts of there are windows of susceptibility to environmental insults, and in this diagram you can see where those boxes are. That's where you're most vulnerable, these critical windows at conception, in the womb, infants and adolescents. You get an insult, those critical stages, they have programming effects, those software changes that can lead to hardware malfunctions of other body systems. It's a wonderful area of which Peter Gluckman, the Chief Scientific Advisor in New Zealand, should be actually communicating better with the Ministry of Health and all the medical officers of health, because this is going to change risk assessment big time, and the dental world hasn't caught up with it. And there was a statement put by a whole lot of these experts, the Faro statement. This is paradigm shift number 2. There are critical windows of vulnerability. The greatest period of vulnerability is in the womb and in early infancy. There's a new paradigm. The timing of exposure makes the poison, and it could be very low doses versus the dose makes the poison. When they put the stuff in the water in the 40s, 50s, they thought, oh, well, it's going to be diluted. It's not going to have any effects. That is not true in the current contemporary scientific world with the recent developments. Early exposures may increase the risk for various health problems later in life into subsequent generations, which have multi-generational effects. There's need to protect the most vulnerable life stages through greater use of precautionary approaches to exposure reduction. So who should bear the burden of proof for safety? So in light of these potential dangers, carrying out research to diminish uncertainty and consequently risk becomes a moral duty. The precautionary principle is vital to protect possible harm to growing children in the face of uncertain risk. Children's heightened developmental sensitivity requires a new policy and public health response to protect them. Advisory and regulatory agencies need to acknowledge animal studies for developmental toxicity associated with fluoridation. The National Fluoride Information Service do not include animal research. They need to, and particularly prenatal exposures in the womb. It's not ethical to be giving a drug or chemical that could be affecting that age group and in the early postnatal life. To give an example how the critical windows of susceptibility fits in with dental fluorosis. Dental fluorosis, is it cosmetic or is it a sign of toxicity? It basically occurs during critical windows of tooth development. It's an abnormal enamel formation when the teeth are developing due to excessive ingested fluoride. And the New Zealand Oral Health Survey showed that 44.5% of New Zealand children and adults aged 30 had some degree of dental fluorosis. Most of it was mild or questionable. 15% very mild to mild dental fluorosis, 2% moderate dental fluorosis. The dentists don't really understand what the mechanism behind it is. If they don't understand what it is, how do they have a clue that's not affecting other body organ systems? There's a whole lot of mechanisms that have been provided, and I won't go into them, but they're still perplexed. What are the critical periods for developing dental fluorosis? Permanent adult teeth, it's the first 4 years for the central incisors, the front teeth. The greatest risk is around about 20 to 30 months. There's no risk by 8 years of age. Interesting, primary baby teeth, there are a few studies, but the highest critical period of risk is in that middle part of the first year of life. The New Zealand Oral Health Survey do not look at that timing. If you're going to get problems from over-ingestion of fluoride during formula use, infant formula use, it's going to be there. So they haven't looked. We don't know how many young kids got an excessive dose during that critical period of development, and it's affected their baby teeth, and it might be affecting other critical baby organ systems that are developing and also are at a window of opportunity for some major issues. Is it a sign of toxicity? I believe it is. There are subtle oral signs of heavy metal toxicity, and they point to problems elsewhere in the body. You can't probably see because it's not very clear, but there's a bluish discoloration on the gums above that teeth where the arrow's pointing. That's a classic sign of lead toxicity. It's called Burton's sign. It's an interaction between the chemical lead and oral bacteria, and it produces lead disulfide or lead sulfides. And if there's a problem there, there's usually a problem in other parts of the body, and the part you want to worry the most in kids is their brains. Mercury toxicity is the same. They used to give kids in the early part of the 20th century some mercurous chloride as a teeth powder for teething, and the kids got a little blue line as well, but they also got what's known as pink disease. It was a manifestation of other problems in other body parts, and it's going to be a sign of acute and chronic toxicity. The dentists have got it wrong. It's a sign of toxicity, an early subtle sign of toxicity. There will be other signs elsewhere. They have not looked. Can fluoride promoters learn anything from the lead story? The graph there shows the regulatory levels in blood that were acceptable, and it's gone down from the 70s and gone down and down and down. And the graph is actually outdated because the level has just been changed now to even lower level. It seems to be there's no safe level of lead in a child's body that's been identified. I think fluoride will be the same because fluoride, lead and arsenic have similar toxicities, particularly for the acute toxicity, and I believe they will have the same because the molecular mechanisms, what's happening at the molecular level that I've been researching, are very similar and they overlap. So what's bad with lead will be bad with fluoride. Studies continue to document significant harm at very low levels of exposure. You get decreased IQ, increased incidence of ADHD and problem behaviours. They're subtle. These kids look normal when they're growing up in infancy. It'll manifest with time. There are now papers from David Bellinger at Harvard saying that risk assessments need to include differential vulnerability and susceptibility patterns and include them. In the New Zealand situation, Wilson and Horrocks in 2008 looked at how long it took the government to act on removing lead from our petrol. And they had weak policies, particularly with respect to the precautionary principle. They took 20 years, even though some of the earliest studies were done here. The child development study in Christchurch by Ferguson and colleagues found that low levels of lead exposed early in life, when they looked at the kids by 18, they had reading levels of no greater than 12-year-olds. They left school early. They did not pass school C. They had no qualifications. They ended up being kids that did not succeed. And I've told you about fluoride interacting and increasing lead absorption. Well, we're putting the stuff in our water. So the risk of reduced IQ. There are no studies done by developed countries that fluoridate, as I said. They don't want to look. If you don't look, you don't find. The recent meta-analysis by Choi and Harvard, mentioned by one of my colleagues, supports the possibility of adverse effects of fluoride exposures on children's neurodevelopment. Over 100 animal studies support it. Okay? there will be some degree of interaction. They may not be as severe as the ones in China, but there are some Chinese studies that have looked at levels that are comparable to what's in our water. 10% of children were at risk of lower IQ and mental retardation with fluoride drinking levels in one study, Zhang, in 2003. There was greater risk of low IQ from fluoride exposure when combined with iodine deficiency. That's a big problem because New Zealand has a high prevalence of iodine deficiency. We're telling pregnant women to take it now, but for the last probably 20 years, the levels have been low. The fluoride might actually be interacting and causing some of the problems. Or if there's low iodine, there may be subclinical hypothyroidism. They don't have any symptoms. You wouldn't pick it up if you're a doctor. But I won't go into that. The thyroid effects. This is the thing that bothers me the most. The excessive dose for thyroid function, I believe, is occurring in those bottle-fed babies. The adequate iodine, if there's adequate iodine, the level that causes... Is that the end? Okay. I will make this available. There are a lot of points that I still needed to cover, but the bottom line is, this is an experiment. You guys need to stop it now.
So I think with the overheads and the presentations that we've seen through the PowerPoint, those will be made available to the council so they can read them. So so you can rest assured they will do so. Okay, so we now have 30 minutes of question time if needed, and thank you for coming back to join us. That's really good. So I'm just going to go to the councillors now. Are there any questions, councillors? Councillor Hennebury.
Yeah, Dr. Scanlon, and I found while you were talking I was going like this with my tongue on my teeth, and I looked at my water and I didn't take a drink. It's quite frightening what all three of you are saying, and obviously my question is around, did you say the health board say that up to the age of 3 there should be no fluoride?
Those are guidelines.
They're guidelines. Yes. So if a formula-fed baby was being mixed up with our the milk with our water, you're saying then that's against the guidelines. Is that how I read it?
All I'm saying is that you can crush a tablet, mix it with water, drink it. Regarding oral supplementation with tablets or drops, I see no difference. The vehicle is different. One might be a tablet form, the other is in water form, liquid form. It's the dose that matters, and the dosage is, I would work out the weight. If I prescribe a drug, I weigh the kid and work out how much I can give them in a day, and might say, and then that's no more than that, because you're going to end up with problems. And for fluoride in particularly, there's a narrow therapeutic range versus the range of when you're going to get adverse health effects. The problem is that the infants under 3 with any amount of fluoride in their water are exceeding the dose. The upper limit that the New Zealand government and Australian government has set is based on that diet nutrient, fluoride being a nutrient, but it's not a nutrient. And secondly, their upper limit exceeds some of the other upper limits, which I think are reasonable. So I think these kids are actually getting excessive dose, and that's the problem. They haven't looked at the thyroid in these kids. The basic thyroid function test that GPs can do will not detect it, and that's another whole area which that's quite complicated, but the testing is not available in New Zealand. They wouldn't be able to pick it up at your average GP. You need specialised testing to detect any effects on the thyroid. But the dose, and I was just going to conclude there, basically the dose that all these kids are getting exceeds the amount which the National Research Council in America said you will get some effect on the thyroid. So these kids are all getting overdosed.
That was my next question, was what is the dose? So look, I'll go from there then to aluminium and the complications. I'm not sure with the Hamilton water, I'm not an expert on our water about the aluminium, but I'll ask that question later, what our aluminium content is. But are you aware of a high aluminium content or a content in our water?
I haven't found any figures for aluminium fluoride in the water, but I believe at the pH level that it would probably dissociate and you'll have aluminium by itself and fluoride by itself. But I'm not worried so much about that. I'm worried about other exposures which you have no control about, and that's the whole problem. You can regulate it at point A and say we put this amount of dose and we leave it there, but you cannot affect any interactions that the person might be getting from the presence of aluminium from other sources. But there will be, that's a good question, and I believe you should find out how much aluminium fluoride is in the water, because you treat it with aluminium sulfate as a deflocculating agent.
Thank you. I'll let somebody else ask the question.
Yes, thanks, Gordon Chester. Look, probably an unusual question. With fluoride occurring naturally in water, the manufacturers and promoters of the bottled water, which has been a great worldwide trend, does fluoride come out of those, many meters deep of fresh, pure water? Does that contain fluoride? And do they, if it does, do they identify that on the bottles as a content?
Most of them don't. And the big difference is those groundwater supplies or naturally occurring water always has calcium with it, and the calcium makes a significant difference. And the original studies in dentistry, the Dean studies, were based on calcium fluoride. Now, the calcium makes a difference, and there have been studies with salmon that have been affected by synthetic fluorides, but not by the naturally occurring seawater fluoride levels, and it's the calcium that makes the difference.
So you took that to the next level, like beer manufacturing and soft drink and all of the other beverages. Would they be taking those water supplies from, I'm not aware of any manufacturers in Hamilton, and sadly the Waikato beer is no longer being made here, but would they be using fluoridated water supplies, or do they treat it in some way?
You take that off.
Majority would be.
Majority of the water supplies would be fluoridated, I would think. Quite likely.
Unless you live in Timaru.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you were drinking a Coke or whatever it might be, and that was from a fluoridated water supply from the manufacturer, would that be shown on the contents?
No.
No, they don't.
Do you think it should?
It should be, because the pH, the acidic pH of beverages is actually when you're going to get those complexes where the fluoride's going to actually interact with either aluminium or other substances.
Because I think you'd agree
and
that's
when
been
it's
a
gonna cause
growth.
the most damage to
Yeah.
teeth because of those acidic pHs.
Okay, thank you.
We understand that our naturally occurring level of fluoride in our water is around 0.2 milligrams per litre. Would you advocate removing that naturally occurring?
Well, there was an Indian study, a fascinating study by Teosha, and he followed about 400,000 kids or people over a 30-year period. And he found it was the ratio of calcium fluoride that made the biggest difference. If there was sufficient calcium, fluoride levels below, I think it was below 1, there was very minimal, there was low caries issues. When it was exceeded 1, there were big problems. And my understanding is no one's actually looked in the context of what you're saying in the very, very low, 0.2. But I mean, the Maori had wonderful teeth prior to the coming of the Europeans, and you know more about this.
I think also you can refer to the studies that have been done in China and India, where fluorine in the water is endemic, and you have a wide range of concentrations, and they studied it at village levels, and extrapolated the fluorine content of the water with health, and they are all quite clear that you can extrapolate it to 0. The best amount of fluorine in your water is 0.
So if I understand that some councils have lowered their upper limit for fluoride added to their water supply, if we were to reduce our upper limit to say 0.7, would you have a comment on your view on
the
that?
The problem is that's the concentration you can set, but if someone's got diabetes and drinks X amount, say it'll take 1 as the level. If it's 1 milligram per litre and they drink 5 litres, they're getting 5 milligrams. So the dose that you would reduce it to does not protect those that drink excessive amounts of water, that have certain medical conditions or retain fluoride, like they have chronic kidney disease. You cover everyone.
And it's total dose, not just what you drink in the water.
And plus they were getting it from lots of other sources which didn't occur many years ago when Trenley Dean did his studies.
And they say that if you taken up to 5 milligrams a day, which is what they reckon is happening for a lot of people who are drinking a lot of water and taking sources from other food sources. Well, that is a point where you will get the first signs of the crippling fluorosis. You get arthritis changes and tissue changes that are disease processes. So it's total dose that is important. And it's quite clear for where they have made the studies on eliminating it rather than adding it, that the great goal would be to have none.
Dr. Scanlon, you have said that the research is of poor quality in this area. Have you advocated for better research, and with whom?
I haven't said it. That's the experts that have done those systematic reviews, the York Review, and they consistently find it is low quality. Those studies that they would have to do are expensive. The developmental toxicity studies that would have to be done, you may not see manifestations for 20 years in some of these adults. It may lead to mental illness. There's a whole of subtle changes that would take a long time. I think it's ridiculous because the benefit is so poor. The complexity of fluoride, and I've been deeply researching this now and thought of a lot of things that need to be researched. I have thousands of questions that I would like to research. I don't think the funding will come because the major government's policy has been to ignore doing any research. There's been no New Zealand research. It was introduced in America and implicated before any research had been done or published. It was introduced in New Zealand. There was no monitoring. We don't monitor the kids that are getting exposed to excessive dosages. We don't look at their primary fluorosis in their baby teeth. You know, the amount of work that would have to be done is phenomenally complex, expensive. It will not be done. That's why they do these cross-sectional studies, their surveys. They're relatively inexpensive and not labour-intensive. I'd love them to be done. You know, the Ministry of Health and various people, DHB, criticised the quality of the studies of research done in China and India, and I agree with them. They should have been done decades ago. And I showed you historically how we've been misled or blinded by this tunnel vision. It's good for the teeth, it's good for the teeth, it's good for the teeth. And they've ignored all the other body systems. The animal studies should have been done. We go against the Nuremberg Code of Ethics. You know, they experimented with humans in the Nazi concentration camps. Well, this is part of an experiment that's unethical because they never did the appropriate animal studies. And they don't even look at the animal studies in systematic reviews. That's changing because I look at the developmental toxicity issues now being raised. You've got to look at those sort of things. I agree. They should be done. They probably won't be done. And the governments that have pushed this for decades will lose credibility massively if they do publish studies that say that everything they've done for the last 40, 50, 60 years is wrong. Why would they want to do them?
And just a personal question, do you use fluoride toothpaste yourself?
No.
Councillor Laurie?
Thank you. To the three of you, I enjoyed particularly the first two speakers, Dr. Scanlon. We've seen you many times around the table. From the three of you presenting, you mentioned money and cost. It's not cheap to go to the dentist. Many people in our communities can't afford it. The medical professionals and others that we're about to hear from who hold the opposite view to you, by their very position on the issue, the result that they're advocating for would reduce visits to the dentist, therefore reducing the revenue to the industry. So I'm trying to see from your point of view what the connection is to cost and money. If someone could explain that to me.
It might not be directly related to your question, but came into my head as you asked it. If we regulated the sugar industry, this would have the single greatest effect on how much it costs you to go to the dentist. Dental decay is not a disease of fluoride deficiency, you've heard that. It's a disease of excessive sugar intake. So if you want to keep your costs of going to the dentist to a minimum, regulate your sugar intake. And given that the council is regulating fluoride administration, it makes just as much sense for you to regulate sugar intake. You should have a sugar-free city.
I think you should also, in South Australia, we've had a big push to take Coca-Cola vending machines out of schools, and that's been met with an enormous opposition school councils are persuaded to, by the money side of things, to have sweets and lollies and rubbish in schools, and there's been terrific arguments to get rid of that. We in my practice, we treat a lot of what I call Coca-Cola-itis, where we have teenagers and early 20-year-olds coming in with total wipeouts, where we literally restore every tooth, or we sometimes take all their teeth out and make dentures. And that's pretty profound. I did 36 of those last year. So where we total clearances.
We had a situation at our local high school, which is in Whangare's unfluoridated low decile 1 school, and some of us got on how high horses and actually got all that stuff taken out of the school, and we thought, well, that's fantastic. But 2 years later, all those vending machines were reintroduced, and the reasons given were the kids leave the school and go over the road to the dairy and buy the white bag full of lollies and the thing, and also the revenue generated from the vending machines was what they were using to buy the computers and the resources for use as on the educational side of it. So what do you do?
Right, any other questions, councillors? Yes, Councillor Forsyth.
Thanks. If you're saying, if you're advocating for that fluoride has little or no effect on helping to stem tooth decay, what would you support as being something that let's say council could do?
We had a pilot scheme operating in a remote rural school in Northland, and the children were given toothbrushes and toothpaste. Admittedly, it was fluoridated toothpaste, which I had an issue with, but during the course of the 6 months, I think it was a year, they brushed their teeth at morning tea when they had their play lunch, and they brushed their teeth after eating their lunch, and had diet counselling as well from the dental nurse working in the school. After that 1 year, the decay rates were noticeably less. And that scheme stopped for some reason. They introduced fluoridation into the water supply instead, which didn't have an effect. So I would be a strong advocate of counselling of young parents bringing their children up about basic preventive care, and then also, of course, diet, careful monitoring of diet.
I would add, looking at vitamin D status, there's some good studies coming out, there's some reviews looking at historical papers. Vitamin D was probably just as important in reducing dental cavities in the time that Dean did his studies. There are older type studies, their quality is also questioned, but there are some studies where people are looking at the vitamin D of the mother during pregnancy and also of the child, and that kids that have severe early caries disease or tooth decay often had low levels of vitamin D. So that's one thing. Calcium supplementation in pregnancy, there's a randomised controlled trial showing that benefited and decreased tooth decay rates. Nutrition, good health habits, looking at the focus should be on pregnancy, getting mums and educating them and encourage them. If they've got bad dental hygiene and bad teeth, that will impact on what types of the bugs that lead to tooth decay are in the teeth. That's just an area which the dental world is just beginning to focus on, and I think that may make massive changes. The behavioural changes, you've got to support the child-mother relationship in the womb and in the first few years and establish it. I come from a big family of 13 siblings. We have great dentition because my mother made the effort to help us to regularly clean our teeth at least 2 or 3 times a day, and twice a day would make a massive difference. Given the fact there's so many kids have asthma, and asthma has been associated with increased dental caries, and lots of kids on antihistamines, they can decrease the salivary flow. The benefits of, and there are studies, Featherston's done some good work in this, and he's just beginning to look at this. You know, we can modify some of those factors early in life, may have profound effects and cost savings down the track. That's what my whole talk is about. What you do early in life affects what happens later in life. And if you modify and work on that area, and you work with the low socioeconomic groups, because they have the bad dental habits, they're the kids that don't clean their teeth and their parents don't. If you modify that, you may get some profound effects. You need milk. Fonterra need to help give some calcium-rich foods. Cheese makes a difference. Xylitol, they influence the types of bugs and how they affect the rates of decay. So yeah, there needs to be a big push towards that.
It's a societal disease. It's not a disease of deficiency of fluorine. It's a disease of poverty of information and attitudinal lack. You have to teach your children to respect their health. There's no silver bullet.
The early intervention in kindergartens is very important. We've had programs in South Australia where we've organised local groups, and this council could, and I don't know the politics and I don't know the funding issues, but certainly kindergarten visits by volunteer dentists was widespread use, and that helped a lot, just to pick up those children that were in that susceptible group early and get them off to school dentists. I think it's very, very important. The kindergarten monitoring is early intervention.
Sorry, another question?
Just one other question, and it's to Dr. Harms. You presented a graph. You said it was the shocking one, I think was the word you used.
Game changer.
Yeah, the game-changing one with Queensland's non-fluoride and the downward trend for everybody. Oh no, it was the flatlining. That's right, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Do you have any other graphs that show similar trends, or is it just that Australian one?
That's been a very common finding, that there's not this great difference between Queensland, unfluoridated Queensland and fluoridated other states. There's just not the difference. It's valid because of the population numbers. There's millions of people in those studies that are drawn, hundreds of thousands of samples. And the bigger the sample size, the more the graphs just flatline. You can take areas that are fluoridated in poor socio-economic areas in Adelaide, which will have far worse decay than, say, non-fluoridated Mount Gambier, one of our cities, for many years. You could actually get the reverse relationship just by cherry-picking data, which is what a lot of the government-type spin will be. But if you look at the larger sample sizes, you get that flatlining effect coming through all the time.
Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Boss?
No, don't worry, we're thinking.
Right. Any other questions, councillors? Did you have another one,
We've got
councillor?
10 minutes. I've got two questions. Look, I think that this has been promoted as a social issue rather than any other issue. So therefore we should mass medicate because of a small social issue. Is that how you understand it?
Well, the Ministry are pushing it that way, but I think they haven't. There are so many variables they haven't controlled for in their research. You know, there's over 100 risk factors for basically tooth decay development, and I don't think it'll reduce social inequalities because you're going to cause other problems. If it is affecting their brain development, particularly the Maori and Pacific Island families that they are not breastfeeding and using formula-fed milk. The decremental changes, which may be subtle on their kids' behaviour and their brain function and their performance at school, may be compounded. And people have looked at the lead IQ and the economic cost of society, and America was, billions of dollars had been estimated because IQ research and economic analysis, there seems to be some associations which are good for predicting things. And I believe that it won't reduce social inequalities. The fact that the Pacific Island people and Maori had darker skin and their vitamin D status has never been assessed in any New Zealand study with relationship to their teeth may actually be the reason that they've got problem teeth and poor nutrition. So, I don't think it'll reduce social inequalities. It's a cop-out. We're fluoridating water and we don't need to do anything else. They need to do a lot more.
The generous thing is to allow that the motivation is to especially help those people most in need, but that's a belief system. It's not a scientific fact system.
It's a lazy public health policy. It's a very lazy policy.
But it's
think,
been
yeah, I'll leave it to
endorsed by
that.
so many people,
Okay.
but they haven't done the proper science.
No.
And that's why I don't believe the endorsements are that useful from right up from the World Health Organization down to the Plunkett. They haven't done high quality scientific studies, so we don't have enough science to inform us on our decision making, which is what the basis of my talk was. And in that situation where there are potential risks, you should not be putting it in the water.
If in doubt, leave it out.
Did you have another question, Councillor Bell?
Some countries add fluoride to their salt rather than to the water. Do you have any views on that as an option?
If they want to buy it, fine.
At least it gives you choice.
Just like you have the choice to take calcium supplements or not. But it's when it's in the water, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. You got to take special means, and you need some money to remove it. And the poorest people can't afford reverse osmosis filters or the means to remove it. So that's another thing that needs to be looked at.
Another question, Councillor Bell?
Yes, maybe a bigger one. I imagine you're familiar with the health submission that we're about to have. Do you find any common ground, areas of agreement with their submission and yours?
I'd say, I wouldn't call it common ground, but the thing that immediately comes to mind when you ask that question is that it does occur to me that they're paid to say it and we're not.
That's not my question.
Right, so is the answer you don't think there is any common ground, or?
Not at this stage.
Right, okay.
There is a common ground in our joint desire to improve dental health, but the mechanism is so warped and it's unravelling, and they don't like that, so the spin is increasing rather than decreasing. They don't like being exposed.
Okay.
May I just say that in Queensland we're going through this similar debate. Queensland was forced fluoridated relatively recently, and now with change of government they've now reversed, and 14 councils already in the last relatively few months have had the courage to change their mind.
Right, okay. All right, any other questions? No. Okay, look, I want to thank you very much for your presentation and for your slides. It's clear you've put a lot of work into the presentation, and I have to say it's been very, very well articulated and very useful for us. So thank you for all the effort and for answering the questions you have. So thank you very much for that. So we're now going to break for morning tea, everyone, and we've got a 15-minute break for morning tea. So we'll be starting back at 20.